Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of the Prague Space Security Guest Lecture Series. My name is Jana Robinson, and I serve as Managing Director of the Prague Security Studies Institute. Our core mission is to help safeguard and strengthen the individual freedoms and democratic institutions of Central and Eastern Europe and beyond. We also work to illuminate emerging threats to the transatlantic alliance and like-minded partners globally, particularly in the economic and financial and space domains. This Space Security Guest Lecture Series was originally launched in collaboration with the Faculty of Social Sciences at Charles University, and it continues to serve as a key platform for raising awareness of the strategic, technological, and geopolitical challenges shaping the space domain. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's lecture entitled Space as a Warfighting Domain and the Relevance of Deterrence. We are delighted to have with us Mr. Nicholas Taylor, a leading expert who has devoted more than 2 decades to advancing deterrence thinking across the UK government, NATO, and the private sector. He has pioneered a novel, integrated approach to deterrence strategy development and implementation. Nicholas is currently affiliated with RAND Europe and King's College London and serves as a member of the NATO Chief Scientist Panel of experts as a subject matter expert on deterrence. This evening, he will explore the evolving concept of space as a warfighting domain, examine how various nations integrate space into their defense and security strategies, and discuss the relevance of deterrence as well as related dynamics such as coercion and assurance in this increasingly contested environment. Nick, we are delighted to have you with us. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Jana, thank you very much. I'm going to try and share my slides. Hopefully there'll be no problems before we get started. And I'd just like to extend my thanks to you and to the rest of the team at PSSI for this opportunity. And also I'd like to extend my apologies to anybody that did try and attend the previously scheduled event. I'm very sorry that I had no power that afternoon and that evening, and so I was unable to do anything that day. But I'm glad to hear we have good numbers joining us today. So greetings from a very dark and wet and windy England. Situation normal, you might say. As Jana said, I'm going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes this evening on the topic of space as a warfighting domain, but really with an emphasis on deterrence. And we should have plenty of time for questions and answers towards the end. So all being well, we've advanced to my second slide just to explain who I am. Jana gave me a very generous brief introduction there, but as she said, I'm now an independent analyst after spending my last 17 years working for the UK Ministry of Defence as a research analyst. And again, I focused most of my time there looking at deterrence. I think it's really important, though, as well, just to bring your attention to the banner at the bottom there and make my caveats and my excuses right up front. Having worked quite a lot with Jana and hopefully many of the people that are in the audience today, I'd like to make clear that I am by no means a space expert at all. So I anticipate there might be some quite challenging questions there. And I'm also going to talk about my understanding of how certain actors, certain states might approach space as a warfighting domain today. And again, this is based on my research from a deterrence perspective. I'm certainly not an expert on any of the nations that I'll discuss today, apart perhaps from the UK, who I will talk about a little bit. But given that I did start research back in 2020 on space as a warfighting domain, and I have worked since then for the last 5 years on space and deterrence for the UK government and also leading a study within NATO. So hopefully I can offer something as food for thought this evening. So what are we going to cover today? Well, this is the main headlines of what I'd like to talk about, and I'll try and keep to time and hopefully stimulate some interesting questions. I'm going to talk about various theories of space warfare that have been proposed over the years and the decades, and then I'll move on to talk about deterrence theory, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, is my real sort of area of interest. And then hopefully throughout the talk, we'll start to knit those two topics together. I'll then describe a little bit about strategic culture, which is work that I've been researching for nearly a decade now, and that's all a part of trying to understand your opponent and trying to understand your adversary with a view from a deterrence perspective of trying to influence their perceptions and their behaviors. And then we'll return back to the space domain and talk about how we can apply the concepts and theories of deterrence that I've outlined to space. We'll focus on some of the sub-bullets you can see there about resilience and redundancy and deterrence by entanglement. And then I'll offer some thoughts, and that'll be the world according to Nick Taylor, on how some nations that might be of interest to us, how we might assess that they're approaching space from a defense perspective, and again as a warfighting domain based on that strategic culture analysis and some frameworks that I've been testing and applying. And then I'll have some closing remarks, and we'll hopefully open up for a good 30 minutes or so of Q&A. So without further ado, let's press on. Again, you've heard my caveat. I'm not a space subject matter expert, but as I said, I've been working on space and deterrence for about 5 years now. And of course, to start that, I had to try and immerse myself into sort of theories of space warfare, for want of a better term. And I've just tried to summarize some of the key points on this slide that I've found most relevant and pertinent. And the first one I think is coming there in the top left in that historical evolution about there was for a long time, an aspiration, and I think it worked for a while of space being, part of the global commons, and a peaceful domain, for sharing, for exploration, for peaceful cooperation. But then, of course, as the global security climate has changed and evolved over the decades, quite a famous phrase came out in the 2011 US National Security Space Strategy, which described space as a contested, congested, and competitive environment. And I think that reflected more actors having access, and just the changing state of relations as we moved out of the Cold War, but then into a more competitive environment, both on Earth and in space. And then in more recent years, as I've been working in this space, no pun intended, there has been more discussion that space is a warfighting domain. And I think that that is, to be honest, partly, to be expected in that it is, really an extension of human engagement. And so I think it is quite likely, and many nations are now viewing space as another warfighting domain. So then down on the bottom, you can see three, what I describe as conceptual models of space warfare that have been proposed throughout the decades and the years that we first started thinking about the possibility of conflict in space. On the left there, you can see the sanctuary model, and this evolved during the Cold War. Again, it's part of that space as a protected environment. And the view there, very much shaped by nuclear deterrence doctrine and so on, was that the military might use space, but that would be as a mainly a strategic domain, maybe an enabler for the use of satellites and communications and so on. But there wouldn't be offensive weapons placed there. There wouldn't be, certainly nuclear weapons, for example. And of course, this was all reflected in the Outer Space Treaty and so on. And that was, as I've said, very much driven by the overarching strategic environment at the time with the advent of nuclear weapons. Now, an alternative model that was proposed, and you can see in the centre there, the high ground model. A key reference that I like to talk about there is Colin Gray and his paper, The Influence of Space Power Upon History. I'm a big fan of Colin Gray. I think he wrote a lot of relevant pieces on deterrence and on strategic culture that have certainly informed my work and my thinking. And again, this really describes space as kind of the ultimate high ground. If you take that kind of terrestrial analogy of seizing high ground, but really space being the ultimate expression of that. And as you can see there, I think that's a quote from Gray at the bottom. The commanding height of modern warfare is to be active in space. And then moving to the right, the combat domain model, which is more recent thinking, but really it extends, more conventional or traditional approaches to conflicts and to warfighting into the space domain. And a reference that I've put down there is the US Space Force's space power doctrine, which really is a true military articulation of how a space might be employed. And then I think knitting all of these together is up on the top right, just some, again, distinct theoretical approaches that various people over the years have tried to bring in to shape and inform this thinking. And in my early research in particular, it became apparent that what a lot of thinkers tried to do was apply extant or accepted air power or even maritime sort of concepts of power into the space domain. And I think there are, various strengths and weaknesses of each of those, whether that's defending lines of communication in space, which has parallels to sort of maritime control. The Clausewitzian view as conflict in space being a continuation of terrestrial politics. And then more recently, Eric Gartz and John Lindsay, amongst others, did a lot of writing in the 2010s about cross-domain deterrence. And really, I think what they were getting at there was how deterrence concepts, translated from the traditional domains of air, land, and maritime into space and also cyber in the 2010s as those domains became more commonly accessible and accepted. So there's quite a lot to unpack there, but I think there's some really interesting underpinning theories about how we might use space and the space domain to achieve, political and warfighting aims and objectives. Now, to move on to deterrence, and you can't really think about one without the other, in my opinion, being someone that talks about deterrence most days of the week, much to my family's boredom. I just like to baseline some of the key theories and concepts of deterrence, and I appreciate this might be pretty old news to many people, but I've been in so many meetings where after quite a long time, we realized we weren't actually talking about the same definitions and the same terminology. I just like to sort of, baseline and set some definitions. And for me, the two main types of deterrence, I like to call them classical sort of deterrence, are deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial. And deterrence by punishment, I think, is the one that we always tend to default to when we think about deterrence, first of all. And that is trying to persuade an opponent not to take an action. And that's by persuading them that something very, very bad will happen to them afterwards. We will impose some costs on them, whether that's, kinetic attack, whether it's financial sanctions, whatever it might be. But we have to convince them that what is going to happen to them afterwards is just unacceptable. So they decide not to take that action. And I've deliberately underlined there the word unacceptable, because I think we have to realize that when we're in a crisis or competition or conflict, actors will often realize there will be some response to their activities. What we have to do, though, is make them not be able to accept those costs. They have to be unacceptable costs, and we have to convince them that those will follow. And then the second classical type of deterrence is deterrence by denial. This often gets overlooked, but it has been mentioned quite a lot in recent years, particularly with cyber and deterrence or with counterterrorism, for example. Because in deterrence by denial, what we try and do is persuade the opponent not to take the action in question, just by convincing them that they won't achieve their intended objective. So whatever it is, they will fail, whether that's because of our defenses, because their equipment is no good. But that's where strong defenses and so on, and resilience and redundancy and so on can play a role. And we'll return to those later on. And you can see the images on the right that hopefully reflect those two types of deterrence. One is a Trident missile, which is a key nuclear weapon that the UK uses for its deterrence by punishment strategy of nuclear deterrence, which was a key theme of the Cold War. And the pictures on the bottom are really to illustrate deterrence by denial. There's a picture of a ballistic missile defense interceptor, because deterrence by denial was a key part of the US BMD strategy. And soldiers there wearing protective equipment to show that they could fight in a chemical weapons environment, which would hopefully convince the adversary not to use chemical weapons. Then a couple of other terms and labels that I think it's good to be familiar with. We tend to refer to immediate and general deterrence. Immediate deterrence is, again, the one we tend to generally think about, which is, an attack is imminent, or we think that it is, a likely prospect. And so we would very much focus on deterring that very specific imminent threat. Now that gets more difficult in the security environment where, you can have prompt global strike, or there are things like cyber attack where there is no real physical manifestation. But immediate deterrence is trying to avert a really imminent threat. Whereas general deterrence is a much more tricky concept to my mind. And it is really sort of how adversaries and opponents perceive you in a time when you're not about to go into crisis or conflict, but it's about how you manage your overall reputation to hopefully avoid getting into conflict. And I like the bullet in the description there in the sub bullet, which I borrowed from Patrick Morgan, who wrote about this in the 1980s when he was describing the Soviet Union and the USA. So it was how they managed their relationship when there was no immediate threat of conflict, but they were still two antagonists that were in competition. So that's that general deterrence reputation situation. And then finally, particularly of relevance to NATO, it's the key part of NATO deterrence is extended deterrence, in which case where you would persuade an adversary not to attack an ally or a partner of yours because you will respond. And clearly that is an absolutely fundamental part of NATO's strategy and NATO's existence, extended deterrence for every member of the NATO alliance. So that's a really quick summary of deterrence ideas and concepts. But I've been really impressed actually with what's in NATO Allied Joint Publication 01. I think it's Allied Joint Doctrine. It covers deterrence really well. Uses slightly different language, but if you're interested, I would really recommend taking a look at that. Now, clearly, deterrence has been around for a long time, as longer as there have been human beings, and it became front and center during the Cold War after the invention of atomic weapons. Deterrence of conflict became the key strategy, certainly for the US and NATO. But when the Cold War ended, deterrence became very much ignored. We didn't really think we needed it. It was the end of history. We were all going to be friends and become liberal democracies. So deterrence, no one really talked about deterrence for a decade or so, but then there was a bit of a resurgence of interest after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 in 2001. But this really focused on asymmetric threats. Of course, it focused on deterrence of terrorists, and particularly religious extremist terrorists after the attacks from Al Qaeda. And there's also a lot of interest in the potential use of weapons of mass destruction by those terrorists. So that's where deterrence research kind of headed, but there wasn't a lot taking place. But what we did see in the 2000s was the development of this concept that became called tailored deterrence. And this was really where this emphasis on understanding the opponent and what was driving and motivating them came to the fore, because that would then shape your deterrence strategy. And so a number of really useful texts that continue to influence my writing. Keith Payne was one of the first people to really describe sort of tailoring a deterrence strategy. I don't have a picture on there, but he wrote a book and a paper on the fallacies of Cold War deterrence back in 2003, which is really, really influential. Then in 2006, the US DoD published its Deterrence Operations Joint Operating Concept. I think that is still extant and still valid and available to download. That is a really, really good reference document that just sets out how we should actively campaign with deterrence outcomes as our objective. A really good document. And then what we're now calling integrated deterrence since about 2022, talks about how deterrence is not just a role for defence and for the military, but should use all levers of power, whether that's dime, fill, diplomatic, informational, economic, and so on. And there are other considerations now that we think about when we talk about and use the word deterrence, when really we're also looking at other levers of influence, I would argue. So we're looking at what inaction means for the opponent. If they don't take that action, what are the consequences that they're going to be thinking about? And we should also give them inducements and reassurances. There needs to be a positive outcome in any crisis or conflict situation. And without getting into appeasement, we need to make sure that we can maybe try and identify acceptable, end states, which can be challenging, but it shouldn't all be about just threats of punishment. And of course, finally, in that bottom bullet, when we're not just talking about nuclear deterrence and existential threats, we have to realize that deterrence may fail in many of these non-nuclear deterrence situations, and we have to be able to deal with those consequences and manage or adjust to those appropriately. So deterrence thinking has really evolved since really, I would say, since 2001. One note that I would make as well, though, is that until quite recently, the majority of that work was was all very much dominated by American thinking. You know, the stuff that I mentioned in the 2000s was very much dominated by the Americans. I am pleased to say now that I think European thinking is catching up and quite rapidly, and I think that's long overdue, and it's a really positive development. So based on that, and based on this emphasis that not every person and not every actor thinks the same, this led me to the topic of strategic culture. And I've researched this for a number of years because I think there is real utility in trying to have some kind of frameworks and structures to understanding how different groups see the world. And so back in, I think it was 2014, I first met a couple of academics who I'm still in touch with now and who I've had the pleasure of collaborating with on strategic culture analysis. And to me, the bottom line of strategic culture is, as it says in that first bullet point, it just avoids us mirror imaging and assuming that the other side would do exactly what we would do in the same situation. And I think when we pause and think about that, that makes absolute common sense. People see the world differently and react and act very differently based on a whole range of factors. Now, my research has shown to me that strategic culture is quite a contested subject. Some people think it's worthless and useless, whereas others think it has great utility. And of course, I'm one of the latter. One of the challenges is that there is no real agreement on what strategic culture is. I guess just as, you know, there may not be much agreement on what culture is. You know, any groups or nation's culture could be very woolly and amorphous and hard to define. My favorite definition is the one I've put there, and that's from Jeannie Johnson, who's someone I've had the pleasure of working with, and Kerry Karchner and Jeff Larson, who published the book on the screen there, Strategic Culture and Weapons of Mass Destruction. But it's really about how in any group, and when we're talking about strategic culture, we're talking about what they tend to call the defense and security elite. So senior military personnel, people in ministries of defense, senior government decision makers, the people that will make decisions about the use of force and conflict, usually in a country, but it may apply to a non-state actor, to a terrorist group. And it's about that description you see there. It's about their beliefs and their assumptions and the way they see the world. And part of that is natural from growing up in a society. But some of it is kind of taught almost implicitly because you join a group, whether you join the military or you join a group within, a civil service or a government that has commonly accepted narratives. And I think that's a great description. And they shape your identity and how you relate to other groups. And so that will then determine what you view to be appropriate ends and means to achieve your objectives. So what is acceptable behavior and what is unacceptable behavior? And I really like that description. And then what I think has been really useful about Jeannie Johnson's research, and like many things in life, this is not rocket science, but Jeannie proposed this framework, for want of a better term, which is literally just four headings. And I don't want to reduce it by any means, but it is these four headings that she suggests that when you're researching a group and its worldview, you should keep these in mind. And they are the ones you see there on the screen. And I've found them really useful in trying to understand other decision makers. So you have identity, and that's not just how a group sees itself, but also how it sees the other and how it differentiates itself from other groups. And that might have roles about national destiny or history or fate, a whole range of things, but they will shape behavior. And then I think closely linked to that are values. What are the things that this group or this nation values? And that might be, like it says there, territory, or it might be, a physical asset, or it might be status, or it might be a concept. But what are the things it really values? Because states will go to war over things that they value. And then based on all of these, there will be norms of behavior. So that's accepted behavior, but also behavior that is not acceptable. And so that might shape things like the use of child soldiers, for example, or chemical weapons and so on. So what is on the possible list of actions, and what are things that we do not expect they will do? And then all these things will shape a group's perceptual lens about how they see the world. But again, that might be true, or it might not be ground truth. It's all about perception. And so that's been really, really helpful for me in applying those lenses to my deterrence analysis. And I think some of that can help us understand the way other nations might approach space. So bringing these two things together, deterrence and the space domain, um, I don't like to use the term space deterrence, which I know a lot of people do, because I think that can really narrow our thinking. And it also can be not very clear what we mean when we say space deterrence. Do we mean deterrence in space or from space or of things in space? So I prefer to use deterrence and space. And I'll just really give a quick summary here of how I've seen how we can relate these concepts of deterrence to the space domain. And I think punishment and denial are absolutely, still relevant and still play a role. But there are certain characteristics of the space domain, certain features that make some elements more challenging, and some facets, I think, more applicable to deterrence in the space domain. And I think, as you can see there, I'll talk about things like entanglement, which, whilst not necessarily, I would argue, a direct deterrence strategy, can have a deterrent effect. And I think things like redundancy and resilience can have more of a role than perhaps they do in the terrestrial domains. So just look into the left-hand column about the nature of deterrence in space. Um, Again, because we don't have many eyewitnesses in space, it's a very long way away and it's very big. Statements of the obvious, I totally appreciate. But that can make things like attribution and even situational awareness or space domain awareness, as I think we call it, make it very, very difficult. So that can make attribution difficult. It can mean a lot of ambiguity in terms of what is going on, what is up there. And as I say there, a real lack of sort of clear thresholds about whether we can identify when a threshold has or hasn't been crossed for a combination of reasons. And for some of these reasons and other things that we'll talk about, I think deterrence by denial has more utility in general terms in the space domain than deterrence by punishment. And in terms of deterrence by denial, we're talking about things like resilience, um, rapid reconstitution, redundancy, and I'll talk about these things in a little bit more in a little while, which to me would hopefully, convince an adversary not to take action against our space capabilities. And I always like to bring in assurance when we're talking about deterrence because assurance is really important, whether that's assurance or reassurance of adversaries. But in this context, I'm talking about assurance of our own allies. And I think that if we do have redundancy and resilience and effective deterrence by denial, that can help us um, help our allies feel confidence in our ability to work together, to cooperate with them, and to ensure that they can maintain access to space capabilities, for example. So I think we always need to keep in mind assurance of allies as well as deterrence of potentially hostile nations. And then I don't really want to dwell on compellence because I think certainly our senior leaders don't really like to talk about compellence and coercion and so on of potentially hostile states. But we do need to bear in mind that space power can potentially have the space to shape adversary behavior as much as we may not particularly like to go down those courses of action unless we really have to. But of course, there are a whole range of challenges that applying these concepts to the space domain have. Um, any actor, I can't just blame it on adversaries, but any actor has the potential to do non-kinetic, reversible, covert attacks that they could easily turn on or off again if they're reversible. They could blame things like space weather. The whole distance, duality and so on can really complicate the attribution of attacks, as I've just said, but complicate how we might respond to what we think could be an attack. And how much attribution is enough for a decision maker in any given context may well vary. So that can really make deterrence hard if we aren't that confident in what an adversary might have done to us in the first place. How can we really credibly threaten a response? Um, I think it's safe to argue that there are still quite few binding norms within space. I know the UK government and the Foreign Office have made great progress in the United Nations on responsible behaviours and so on. But again, personally, I'm something of a skeptic when it comes to norms of behaviour because they are good and they do serve a purpose in setting standards of behaviour. But when it comes to conflict and existential situations, norms can go out of the window very, very quickly. There's a lot of interest and work going on dual use capabilities in space, and many satellites and so on do have dual capabilities, whether it's payloads, whether it's users and so on. And so there can be a great risk of misunderstanding what an asset might be doing. Is it maneuvering to use a military capability, or is it simply a civilian capability that's on board there? So again, that can really complicate decision making, and then risk escalation if we misinterpret, or if any side misinterprets the intent behind what's going on in space, which of course links to that last bullet point about escalation risks. And a key one there is, of course, the dependence of many nations' nuclear command and control on space-based capabilities. And so I think that makes any potential threats to space-based capabilities that are associated with nuclear capabilities a real potential red line, in that we really wouldn't want to risk threatening those, or potentially holding them at risk, for fear that that might trigger a response from an adversary. So lots of uncertainty and challenges there, I think, in applying traditional concepts of deterrence to the space domain. What I did mention a second ago that I'd like to just expand on a little bit more is where the roles of resilience and redundancy, I think, can play a role and contribute to deterrence. So I'll just offer a few points on each of those, and try and just clarify what I mean by those two terms, because I do think they are different, if possibly slightly related. So, of course, with redundancy, it's when we'll have multiple overlapping systems that might all contribute to delivering a function or a capability. An example I put there is multiple GNSS systems. And basically what that means is that if one of them, is taken out, is attacked, becomes redundant, it means that another pathway or another capability can step in and fill that capability gap. And if we can communicate that and potentially even demonstrate that to adversaries, and hopefully we could, persuade them not to try and attack them to remove that capability, because we'll simply slot in something else to fill the gap, and it will have no effect. Our operational effectiveness will not be reduced at all. So that's a key one that we can use to try and deter attacks on our capabilities, if we can communicate that across, and let adversaries know that we have redundancy. And then perhaps linked to that as well, but slightly different, is resilience. And the way I understand resilience, and of course this has great relevance to terrestrial planning and deterrence as well, is an ability to absorb shocks and crises and attacks, and to adapt and to recover. So there might be some slight impact, but we very rapidly recover our abilities, whatever those might be. And there are different ways we can do that. We can do it by hardening satellites, having maneuverability, by providing technical ways to do it. We can have really resilient architectures that, again, maybe have redundancy in them, that have fallback options, that have multiple pathways. Or we could do it operationally with different routes of command and control, and so on. And I found this picture online a few weeks ago that I thought was quite impressive, of that is apparently 6 Starlink satellites just moving in a chain that was taken, from the surface of the Earth, and it just shows, just the sheer volume of satellites that are going up into space now. I think definitely contributes to resilience, notwithstanding it presents a whole range of other challenges. And of course, the point behind that, similar to redundancy, is it means that, an adversary's attack on our systems will have no operational effect whatsoever. Our operational effectiveness is not reduced. So hopefully we'll convince them not to bother, because they're wasting resources for no real benefit or no real gain from their perspective. I mentioned earlier deterrence by entanglement. Interestingly, I've had a couple of conversations on this topic just in the last few weeks, and it's been one of those labels that I've seen, bounced around a few times in recent years, but it just seems to have become quite current recently. There are lots and lots of different types of deterrence having been proposed over the last 10 to 20 years. Some of them I think are more useful than others. Deterrence by entanglement, I would define as, in that first line there, as when states are deterred from doing things because it will have an adverse effect on them as well. And so in the space domain, what we're probably talking about is if there are mutual dependencies on either shared systems that are in orbit or something like that. I think perhaps the biggest example, though, is the recognition that if there are kinetic attacks in space that would cause, significant debris risk, that would affect every space user. And I think that's a really good example of deterrence by entanglement. You can see in italics there, I've put up a phrase that I saw used of mutual assured disruption. That, if someone did do a big sort of kinetic ASAT, it would have effects on every space user potentially. So I think there is something to deterrence by entanglement. The fact that so many nations and space users are, linked together through the use of shared capabilities and so on and so forth, that any hostile act, could possibly have an effect on the aggressor. I guess the final point I would add to that, though, is that as a bit of a deterrence geek and a deterrence anorak, I'm not actually sure that, deterrence by entanglement is sort of an agreed type of it's not a deterrence strategy that I think people set out to enact. I think it's more of a secondary effect just of the environment that we find ourselves in. So my final point is I think it's more of a stabilizer and a stabilizing consequence rather than a dedicated sort of tool or strategy that someone might choose to use. But it can have an effect, I would say, on decision making of any actor with regards to space. So I think I'm going to start wrapping up now, looking at the clock. What I'm going to do now is try and wrap some of these things together. And what I've tried to do, notwithstanding my caveat from the beginning that I'm not a space expert and I'm not an expert on any one nation other than perhaps the UK, having lived here most of my life. I'm just going to try and bring all this together to think about how applying some of these lenses, putting the strategic culture lens and those headings that I've found really useful over a bunch of nations to see how I think that might impact their approaches to both space as a warfighting domain, but then their approach to deterrence and space. And again, this is, my analysis, and I'd be really interested in people's thoughts on it. So, looking at the UK first, and I know it's always hard to do assessment of ourselves, but again, this is where I am, and so most of the people I speak to every day are from the UK. So I got a bit of a head start. But I would describe the UK's approach to space in the military community as being very much guided by multilateral cooperation. We host RAF Fylingdales, which is US based. We're a member of CSPO. We do many, many things multinationally. We've always stressed responsibility, legality, proportionality, and so on. I talked about the work that our foreign officers led in the United Nations on norms of behavior. So very much looking at transparency and partnership. So all of these things, I think, bring together how the UK and the UK military has approached space and space operations. I think we were quite not slow, but we weren't the first nation to talk about space warfare and space as a warfighting domain. But I think our approach to deterrence in space would really be more about, reinforcing the rules-based system, and reassuring allies and adhering to norms and so on and so forth, rather than, having offensive capabilities and looking to be more coercive, in the space domain. Not that we have that many space capabilities right now. So I think that summary at the bottom there is sort of a stewardship-oriented approach, and definitely multilateral is how I would describe the UK and the UK military's approach to space. Now in the US, traditionally our closest ally, I would like to think. I've used those headings of the values and norms and so on. And again, be really interested in people's views and takeaway on this because there's often not a right answer. But I think looking at US colleagues and partners, and I've worked with the US throughout my entire career, I think there is a definite belief in kind of technological mastery, and this emphasis on freedom of access. And then as I've said there, I think the US would see stability as being able to dominate, in the space domain. What I like a bit further down is the part about identity. And I think this is often overlooked, but I definitely think from my engagement with US colleagues is that not just now, but historically, the US has always been an absolute leader in terms of space exploration and so on. And I think they absolutely, even if it's subliminally, would see space as an extension of that frontier ethos of the way America was, settled and so on, and expanding and heading west. And I think there is a similar spirit in America's approach to space. But as we also referenced, US documentation right at the beginning of the presentation about approaches to space warfighting and so on, I think the US absolutely does see space as a warfighting domain, which is, I would say, slightly different to the UK. But they do, I think, still think that resilience and denial are. I think they see more benefit in them and more effect at the moment than sort of deterrence by punishment. But we'll see if that changes over time. Um, be very interested in views on that. So that's two NATO nations. What I've also done is taken a look at Russia and China. And again, caveat, I'm not an expert on either of those nations. So I've got a slide for each. For Russia, and I think a lot of this, is very similar to how they view war fighting and relations, with NATO and the West in the terrestrial domains. But in terms of their values, a deep distrust of Western intentions, um, strategic depth as an enduring theme, and I think that is a direct translation from the terrestrial, the huge geography of Russia, and I think they take that same conceptual thinking into the space domain. I think there is a huge role for Russian and Soviet identity in the way Russia approaches space. They absolutely see themselves as being front runners, going right back to Sputnik and the 1950s and 60s in space exploration. But they absolutely see themselves as a great power. They're the same, for example, in their Arctic exploration and so on. They are absolutely their self-perception and identity is as a great power with regard to space. And they tie that to their sovereign capabilities. They're a technically great nation. Now, in terms of how that affects their norms of behavior, I think they are entirely comfortable with the military use of space, with weaponizing space. They see it as a great way to challenge Western technical advancements through challenging in space. But again, I think they quite like being ambiguous and having dual use capabilities, and trying to be quite ambiguous about their activities in space, whether that's to sort of conceal hostile acts and so on and so forth. So coming down to the bottom right and perceptual lens, I think the bottom bullet is really important. Deterrence with compellence, because I think there is general agreement that the Russian concept of deterrence is quite different to ours, and is much closer to compellence or coercion than we would perhaps think in the West. And I think that will absolutely be manifest in how they would behave in space. So quite unpredictable, high risk tolerance, and quite willing to be sort of compelling stroke coercive in space to achieve their objectives. Finally, I'll talk about China. China, I've not done very much work on in my career, so I'll put that sort of caveat up there. But from the research that I've done in recent years, through a strategic culture lens, these are my sort of findings on how China is approaching space. And again, these apply both to the terrestrial domain, but I've tried to apply these things to how China might be approaching space as a military domain. Very much focused on information and information warfare, and see sort of space as an extension of that potentially. Along with many other parts of the Chinese military, there's no real distinction between the civil and military and commercial activities. So it's quite hard, I think, to determine what any potential platform might be doing up there. It's quite hard to distinguish. In terms of national identity, China absolutely sees itself as a rising power. There's frequent references to the century of humiliation in writings about China and how they absolutely are keen to put that behind them and be seen as a peer competitor to the US. And I think they see space as a real vehicle for them to be able to do that. I think they absolutely think that space is a military domain. We've seen them do kinetic ASAT tests as a clear display of Chinese power and will and capability. But I think that they also see US actions as being quite hostile to China, trying to encircle them, trying to enforce US norms of behavior and so on and so forth. So I think a real quite different approach there to perhaps what we saw from how I understand UK and US approaches. But again, really interested in people's views there. And the reason I try and bring these out is, again, I think it's really important to try and maximize our understanding of our opponents, of other actors, so that we can then, from a deterrence perspective, try and seek to influence their perceptions in order to influence their decision making and their behavior. So that's where I've found real utility in doing this kind of analysis before I start developing a deterrence campaign. So some closing thoughts. I think we're not doing bad for time. It's been a bit of a whirlwind tour. Deterrence is absolutely back front and center within the UK, within the NATO alliance, after being really ignored for at least 10 to 15 to maybe 20 years. And thinking has evolved from the Cold War. I had a slide that was titled "The Fourth Wave." And I don't know if you saw there was a small footnote at the bottom there for a really good article written by Jeffrey Knopf back in 2010, which summarized that wave of analysis from sort of 2001 to 2010 that really moved deterrence thinking forward. There are some arguments now that we're in a fifth or even a sixth wave. I'm really not sure about that. I think potentially fifth. And this was arguing that this was all focused on deterrence of hybrid and sub-threshold threats. Sixth wave, I'm very skeptical about, but this has been proposed by some US colleagues talking about the three-body problem of China, Russia, and the US as nuclear peers. But deterrence thinking continues to evolve. But as hopefully you've picked up, I find the developments made during that fourth wave in the 2010s, looking at tailored deterrence, understanding your opponent, bringing in all levers of power, really, really relevant and still absolutely, pertinent to the kind of challenges that we're looking at today, and particularly to the space domain. So I think we still have a lot of work to do to unpack, and be comfortable with how we can apply these concepts to the space domain. And I think that's partly because the space domain, is developing rapidly with capabilities and concepts and so on, but also because we're so far behind on our thinking on deterrence and compellence and assurance and so on. We've got a lot of catching up to do. And what I've seen in war games over the last sort of 5 years is that we shouldn't really think about just space deterrence. We've got to think about the whole system, the segments. We've got to think about the orbit, the link, the ground, everything that might influence decision making, whether it's in orbit, wherever it might be. Space is just one part of any kind of warfighting system. But I do believe that there is a real clear role for, as you can see there, the resilience, redundancy, attribution, and so on, rather than deterrence by punishment. And I think that's echoed in most of the writings. But I think if we, make an effort, if we put some time and some effort and some work into understanding how we can apply these concepts of deterrence and assurance in the space domain, I think we absolutely can make sure that we don't have inadvertent escalation. We don't accidentally find ourselves in crises and conflict, and that we can limit escalation and hopefully, as we move forward through what are really some quite challenging times, maintain stability and hopefully find ourselves on the right side of history and stay in peace as we move forward over the next few months and years in very uncertain times. So with that, I will stop talking. I really look forward to the questions and the discussion. I hope there are plenty. I don't know if you want to stay on this screen but I'll take any instruction and I'll look forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Nick. I think you can turn off the PowerPoint.
Perfect.
You can have a better view. Also, to you and to audience, this is a webinar format, and we will stop recording this part for the Q&A. Thank you, Nick, for a truly insightful and thought-provoking presentation. And to our audience, thank you for joining us for this latest lecture in our Space Security Guest Lecture Series. We greatly appreciate your continued engagement and look forward to welcoming you again soon, probably in February, as we explore the challenges and opportunities shaping the future of outer space governance.